All right, good evening, everyone. We're just going to let some folks trickle on in. Right, fantastic. Thank you so much for tuning in this evening. As people are trickling in, just want to highlight that there is a poll that we'd like for you all to do. Just an opportunity for us to learn a little bit more about who's on the call tonight and how we might be able to connect with you later or adapt our future webinars to better meet your needs. So if you could just take a quick moment to fill that out, that would be amazing. And then we will get started. So while you all are getting the poll filled out, I'm going to go ahead and get my show up. Fantastic. And I also want to highlight that this Zoom webinar does have closed captioning enabled. So if that's something that is helpful for you, we are providing that. Anyone who does not want that or finds that distracting, you can opt out of it. You just have to click a button at the bottom of your screen. Fantastic. Well, we have quite a lot to cover this evening, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Kali Cawthon-Freels. My pronouns are she, her, and I am one of the tutor managers here in Atlanta. I work with a lot of students myself and also help train our tutors on how to be good tutors, how to be good educators. And frankly, writing for me is a really it's a sweet spot. It's one of my favorite things to teach students how to do in terms of how to develop their voices as writers. All right, so in terms of our agenda for tonight, we've got quite a lot to cover. So we are going to jump right on in. This is where we're going. I did see a question indicating, will this presentation get sent out? Yes, you should expect it in your inbox tomorrow, I believe. So you will be able to have access to this for anyone who has registered. So here's where we're going. We're going to start a little bit with Applerouth's why. Why do we do what we do here at Applerouth? And then we're going to talk through kind of the touch points of what makes good writing. Okay, what makes the written communication so important, why we should care about it, and how we can improve on it. Okay, so this is where we are heading. Let's start with Applerouth's why. Okay, so our motto here at Applerouth is when you change students' self-beliefs, you change their lives. At Applerouth, we care a lot about not just helping students with their academics, just so they can pass a test. That's not really what we care about. We care about helping them build their self-efficacy. So yes, they can do good on whatever test is coming up, but that those skills are skills that they carry with them for the rest of their lives. That comes down to how they view themselves as students and as people. And we'll get into more of the kind of like physiology of that a little bit later. But we want to help build students' self-efficacy so that they can tackle challenges confidently. Be those challenges in their sporting arenas, on the performance stage, in the classroom when they're learning, studying, learning how to study, all of that good stuff. We're going to make sure that we're impacting all those areas of life. So the way that we go about that specifically at Applerouth is we focus on 3 different areas. We've got academic tutoring, which is kind of the sphere that we are in this evening with a workshop on writing, test prep. So of course, ACT and SAT, but also other exams like high school admissions exams like the Shazat if you're up in New York, or the SSAT, the ISEE if you're in elementary school and middle school looking for school admissions exams. We also help with the GRE, and then we also help with executive functioning coaching. That's what Dr. Jed Applerouth likes to call the invisible syllabus of school. The things that come intuitively to some students, but not to others. So organization, how do you stop procrastinating? How do you keep track of all of your assignments so you know what's due when and can prioritize appropriately? So these are the areas that we like to help students build that self-efficacy. We want to see the students right there where all 3 of those circles intersect beautifully in the Venn diagram. Okay, so that's kind of our why. We want to help students become better learners for life. And we do that by giving them the skills to help them feel confident. So a brief history of writing and why we should care about it. Okay, so back in the Industrial Revolution, factory workers or the factory managers realized that factory work benefits from having a literate workforce. It helps with safety, it helps with productivity, right? However, they there wasn't really value, at least they didn't see that there was value to them actually teaching the workforce how to do it, right? You want to bring folks into those facilities who already know how to do those things so that the factory work can focus primarily on building whatever it is they're building. Unfortunately, that is still very much the mindset of many institutions today, where the workforce, the management values a workforce who can write well and communicate in the written word well, but doesn't necessarily see the benefit of taking time out of their day to teach those skills, right? Because again, when we think about a capitalistic society, the goal of these industries is to put product out, right? And so taking time out of the business day to teach folks how to do this better cuts into the time to make product, right? Education is certainly advanced in many ways when it comes to how we teach students how to write. But when we get to English classes specifically, there's so much to teach, right? I know the experience for me and most of the students that I work with is that elementary school and middle school is focused on making sure that we've got the grammar rules down so that we can put together a sentence that makes sense. But that's about it, making sure that we can communicate in a way that's grammatically cohesive. Then we get to high school and the emphasis shifts. All of a sudden, the focus is less on writing and more about exposing students to good literature, which is not a bad thing, right? I just want to say that super clearly. It's one of those things where our teachers have so much that they have to teach the kids and something's got to give. So as a bookworm, I very much enjoyed all of the reading that I did in high school. Certainly enjoyed that over the writing, but much like the experience of my students, it wasn't until my freshman year of college when I had a legitimate writing seminar where we sat down and we talked about how do we express these ideas in more nuanced ways? How do we analyze things with nuance, with context, and in such a way that it's clear to our audience what we're talking about? So writing is still a key to success in pretty much any industry in the world today. There are some places that will require you to provide samples of your written work as part of a job interview. For students on the call, you've got your admissions essays when you're getting ready for college. You've got to be able to write your resume. There's so many things that we have to be able to write well, right? So that's a big portion of why we should care about it, right? It's such a fundamental skill for success for the rest of your life, not just in school. However, there's another reason that I really care about it, and it's one of the reasons why I really love helping students develop their craft as writers. It's because the written word is a way to express your own voice, to show people a little bit of who you are. And not to sound like an old fuddy-duddy for a moment here, I think one of the biggest negative impacts that social media has had on society is our ability to write something and post it without any revisions. We don't take time to sit on it. If I have an idea right now, I can have it on Facebook 30 seconds from now, which is helpful sometimes, but it doesn't necessarily help us grow as writers. It doesn't force us to sit with those things and learn how to communicate that idea better or in a more concise way. Because I don't know about you all, but if I'm scrolling on Instagram and a photo has 8 paragraphs underneath it, I'm probably not going to take the time to read that because the author has not taken the time to express their idea concisely, right? So 2 big reasons we need to care about writing. One, because it can affect the rest of our lives in terms of how we do in school, what job opportunities are available to us, what makes us look like a competitive applicant for colleges, for different jobs, etc. But also because it allows us to communicate ourselves to the world confidently. It allows us to express our opinions and our ideas in a way that is truly reflective of who we are, right? I think it's really easy in this advent where we don't take time to edit our social media post, where you can put something out there, come back to it a couple hours later and realize, that doesn't communicate what I thought it communicated about me, right? So we want to make sure that we're able to portray ourselves to the world as authentically as possible. Okay, so now we're going to get into more of a structured portion of how do we grow as writers? What are the things that we need to keep front of mind in order to communicate effectively? The first thing is we have to know our goal. We can't just start writing and hope that a goal appears. We need to identify what the target is, and then we can structure whatever the piece is around that goal. Okay. Knowing the goal, what you're trying to accomplish, will also tell you what kind of writing you need to be doing. So here are some examples. If your goal is to tell a story, then maybe you're making up a story. Maybe it's a fiction story. But if it's a self-reflective story, that's more of a memoir, right? Are you trying to explain something, right? Are you analyzing something, or are you giving instructions, in which case that writing needs to be incredibly detailed, right? Or are you offering an opinion? Is it argumentative? Are you making comparisons, which is what that juxtaposition is, right? So knowing what your goal is allows you to identify the category that your writing falls into. And in each of those categories, there are different tools that can help you, right? So the scope of tonight's webinar isn't quite big enough to get into the super nitty gritty of all of the different tools and all of those different kinds of writing. I definitely want to encourage you to check those out because those tools will be useful tools in your toolbox to elevate your writing. Okay, so now that we have identified our goal, we don't get to just start writing. We have a few more steps that we need to take. I cannot underscore enough the importance of brainstorming and pre-writing. This is something that I have to get on to my students about all the time, which is, again, I think that potential issue with posting things on social media, right? You don't have to take time to pre-write or brainstorm. You can just write it out and post it within a minute. So brainstorming and pre-writing is just really about identifying what are the things related to what I want to write about. Okay, and there are a couple different pre-writing exercises. So let's take a look at some of those. The first is free writing. And this is typically helpful for folks who work well without a lot of structure. So this is really about just getting ideas out. So let's say hypothetically, well, this is an example that's going to show up later in the presentation tonight. Let's say we're writing a paper on how to reduce our carbon footprint. Okay, if you're doing a free writing exercise, we want to jot down everything that comes to your mind when you think about reducing your carbon footprint or your family's carbon footprint. Okay, so often in this exercise, you're going to end up with more ideas than you can feasibly fit into a paper, and that is okay. Okay, the goal is not to take all of your free writing and somehow manage to force it into a paper that makes sense. The goal is to use free writing to create kind of an inventory and then take out a couple of things that you need, right? So if you're doing free writing, you end up with, say, 12 ideas, you may end up using 3 or 4 of them in whatever paper you're writing, depending on the scope of your project, how long it needs to be, and things of that nature. Okay, so this point at the bottom of the screen certainly doesn't go without saying. Your free writing should not be your final draft. Free writing can sometimes look pretty spastic, if you will. I know my free writing notes tend to be a little bit all over the place. So you definitely want to make sure that that is not your final draft. So let's say you're listening to this and you say, Kali, that's great, but I need structure. I can't just stare at a blank page and expect something to come out. That's totally fine. We've got some other free writing exercises that you can do, or pre-writing exercises, pardon me. This one is a bit more structured, the journalist question. So your who, what, where, when, and how. You could throw a why in there as well. So this is a fantastic way to add some structure and can be applied to several kinds of writing. Let's say I've got some creative writers in the group and you're working on writing a short story for a class. Okay, this is a great way to build some character backgrounds. Who's your character? What's their motivation? Where are they from, or where are they going in the story? When does their main point of action take place, and how do they fold into the plot, right? Like, how do they fold into the narrative of the piece? This is also fantastic for anyone who's doing any kind of analytical writing, or any kind of investigative writing. And we can also see, I think, at least how this folds into any kind of analysis that you might even do for science class, right? It's very similar to the scientific method when we're looking at all the pieces that are involved here. So your journalist questions is one that's a bit more structured that we can look at. So maybe you're saying that work sounds great. It sounds a little bit more structured, but I'm a visual learner, Kali, and I need to be able to see something that I can plug stuff into. Okay, so another kind of pre-writing exercises that you can do is outlining. And there are a couple of ways to do outlining, or pardon me, concept mapping. I'm getting those two flipped, my apologies. So outlining would be more just like the outline on the screen, but we can use concept mapping to help us with outlining. So concept mapping is the visual way to organize that information. And if we were to use concept mapping to kind of put it into an outline, we just basically take the components of the maps and plug them in to the outline. That'll make more sense in just a moment when we look at some of these examples. So with this concept map, this is called a T-graph. It is fantastic for comparing particularly two things because we have that little cross looking thing down there. It looks like a lowercase t. And at the top, we have our two subjects. And then if you notice each of the rows are comparing similar categories between the two. So we're looking at Mickey and Donald, so classic little example here. That top row is looking at what kind of animal they are. In the middle row, what kind of clothes they wear. In the bottom row, what their demeanor is, what their personality is. So when you're making a T-graph, it's helpful to make sure that all of your rows line up, that they're looking at the same kind of thing. Okay. You can also do this for more than two things. At that point, you would just continue to extend that horizontal top row and add more vertical rows. At that point, it looks a little bit less like a T, but it still functions the same. It's absolutely fine. Another fantastic concept map here is a Venn diagram, kind of like what we saw earlier when we were talking about Applerouth's Y. So Venn diagram is basically the two circles each represent their own font, and the place where they overlap is where those two different things share stuff, right? So here we've got vampire chocolate, Count Chocula is where they intersect there. And you can do that with a wide variety of things. Like you could have 3 circles like we had earlier, 4 circles, so on and so forth. We just want to make sure that we identify all of the places where they have similarities and differences. I find a Venn diagram to be particularly helpful if I'm not just looking for the differences between two things. Like on the previous slide, the T graph really highlights a lot of differences here. The Venn diagram gives us differences and similarities. Okay. So this last one, I feel like it's good for just related ideas, not necessarily ideas that you're comparing or contrasting, but it's a way to show how different ideas are connected, right? So then you would have one central bubble in the middle, and then you'd have smaller bubbles branching out, depending on how they're related to that central bubble. Interestingly, you can also make little offshoots off the smaller bubbles, right? So like if we go to that car bubble, if we wanted to get a little bit more specific, we could look at station wagon versus SUV versus sports car, right? And keep breaking off until essentially we get into name brands, I suppose. But this just allows you to identify how big the scope of the idea is you're talking about. And it allows you to identify, do I need to narrow my focus? Is it feasible for me to fit all of this stuff into whatever it is I'm talking about? So we've talked about a couple of different ways to brainstorm, to do some pre-writing, to make sure that we've got some ideas that we can play with, right? At this point, we want to write with purpose. We want to take these ideas and make sure that they are focused toward a particular goal, right? So this comes back to the goal that we identified earlier. Another way to frame what the goal of your essay should be is to ask yourself, what should the reader get out of this? by the time they finish. Okay, if I want the reader to read this short story and feel empathy at the end of it, what do I need to say in order to get them there? How do I use the components from my pre-writing to lead them there? Same thing with an analysis. What should the reader learn? Like, what are the important facts they should know at the end of this paper? What facts do I need to include in order to get them to that conclusion? Or an argument, how should the reader just should they agree with me? Sorry. And what pieces of evidence do I need to put in there to support my argument? Okay, so looking at how do we purposefully integrate all the great pieces from your brainstorming and pre-writing. Again, you may not be able to include everything that comes from pre-writing, and that's okay. That's not the point of pre-writing. Pre-writing is just to get the juices flowing, get some ideas out there, so you've got some things to pull from. A rule of thumb that I use with my students is you can always take away, right? If you have 80 bajillion ideas, that's fantastic. We can always take stuff out of that to use for your writing. It's a lot harder to try and artificially add something to your essay. So the more that we have to work with at the beginning, the more we can kind of whittle it down to just the components we want to focus on. Okay, so when it comes to actually getting into crafting the piece that you're writing, a three-pronged thesis is a great place to start. It's a classic writing tool, and it allows us to create a fantastic structure. So this is great for particularly like my middle school students, maybe early high school students. It's a great place to get started. I will say that it's just that starting point, right? Here we have an example of a thesis. I said that this example would come up later on. So individually, we can help reduce microplastic pollution by purchasing reusable containers, supporting local agriculture, and making food at home. So here we've got a thesis that's talking about what we can do to reduce microplastic pollution. Okay. If we dig into it a little bit more, you'll notice that we have identified 3 specific argumentative points that we can focus on, which will then allow us to build, that classic 5-paragraph essay. Again, this is a starting place, but we can always grow things from here. So what might this look like as, more of an essay? We've got the introduction. That thesis should generally be the last sentence of that introduction. And then typically with a 3-pronged introduction, you would have 1 paragraph highlighting each of those things, and then finish with a conclusion. So when it comes to any essay that you're writing at home, let's say this was an assignment that you had for school, you've got a couple of weeks to work on it. It's not a test at school. It's not something that you have to do. When it comes to something like this, I strongly recommend writing your introduction last. Sounds a little strange, but bear with me. One of my professors in grad school recommended this to all of us, and her argument was you can't introduce nothing. You need to know what the rest of your finished product looks like before you can craft an introduction that introduces it properly, right? So that's something that I have found really helpful in my own writing, and I offer it tonight if it is helpful for you. And if you haven't tried it before, I would recommend trying it out. See what it's like to work through the rest of your essay and then say, okay, well, what do I have? What introduction would do it justice, would introduce it in the best way possible? So obviously that will not work if you're in a timed setting at school, in which case you just want to make sure to go back with any time that you have at the end of that timed exercise to make sure that your introduction does in fact match the rest of your essay and make any edits as needed. Last thing about this kind of structure, another thing that you want to make sure to do with something like this is that your introduction and your conclusion absolutely directly mentions everything in the rest of the essay. That same grad school professor said to us, more or less exactly like this, that your essay should have 3 parts, or should do 3 things. First, You should tell me what you are about to tell me. That's your introduction. Second, you should tell me what you're going to tell me, which is the body of the paper. Third, tell me what you told me, which is the conclusion. Obviously, her words made quite an impact. So now that we've kind of got this outline, if you will, of our essay here, we've got a place for an introduction, the 3 body paragraphs that we're going to have, the conclusion. We also want to make sure that the transitions between sentences within the paragraph are smooth, and the transitions between paragraphs are smooth, right? There's nothing worse than reading a paragraph, you're reading about one particular thing, and then all of a sudden, bam, it's like whiplash. The author just like takes you to this place with no warning, no transition whatsoever. And it's like, well, wait a second, I thought we were talking about this other place, this other thing, right? That can easily leave your reader confused, which we do not want to do. Okay, so if you are eliciting feedback from someone, a great way to elicit feedback is to say, hey, does this transition smoothly from idea A to idea B? It's also a fantastic way to give feedback if a friend has asked you to provide feedback on something. Okay. So when we're looking at how to make sure that those transitions are smooth, having statements set up like this can be super helpful, right? So we've got some of our standard transition words like your fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. There are also there's a plethora of other transition words that all do different things, right? Some add emphasis, some indicate that we're adding on to a previous idea, some indicate that we're contrasting from a previous idea, and then the others indicate sequence. Okay, all of these can help us transition, particularly between paragraphs, right? So when we're also transitioning between these paragraphs, I think it's important to make sure that the ideas themselves connect. So let's hop back real quick to our example on the microplastics here. So if I were to end example 1, that first body paragraph, with something along, by using reusable containers, we are limiting the plastic that we are bringing in our home. That would be the end of that paragraph. I jump down to the beginning of paragraph 2 for our body. That's not the only way we can stop using or bringing extra plastic into the home. By engaging with local agriculture, we're often getting produce straight from the source that avoids extra packaging, right? So beginning of that was maybe a little clunky, but you can see how I've connected those 2 ideas, right? It's 2 separate paragraphs, but I've made that transition nice and smooth by echoing back to what the first paragraph was about. But I've also made it super clear to my reader that, hey, we're moving on to a different argumentative point here. We're going to start talking about local agriculture. Okay, so doing that, I don't want to say it's quite as strong as like hand holding your reader, but it's more allowing them to more easily track the ideas that you want to communicate. Because like I said, the last thing we want is for you to switch from one idea to the next and your reader be confused. Okay, so this is a fantastic list of words. I would definitely recommend, if you're a parent, making sure that your student has this chart, or if you are a student on this call, maybe take a screenshot of this and say that, like, you will have access to the slides later, but this particular slide is one maybe to have on your desk. Okay, so at this point, we've done our pre-writing, we've structured some paragraphs, we've added transitions to make sure that they are effective, and we are not done yet, not at all. We want to make sure that we allow for time to revise, to edit. So whenever I'm working with students on writing, we work backwards from the due date of whatever their assignment is, and the final draft of that is not to be finished the day before it's due, at minimum 2 days before. And we usually have a session when we've right before that 2-day deadline, so that we can make sure that the final draft is indeed final. Because sometimes you write something in the moment, you think it sounds okay, and then you let it sit for a couple days, you come back to it and you realize, that sentence is not as clear as it could be, or that piece of evidence isn't as strong as I thought it was. Okay, so revision gives you an opportunity to go back and make sure that whatever you've written is saying what you really think it says or what you think it really should say. Okay, so we want to make sure that for any kind of paper that you write for school, you are building in time to edit. Absolutely. And that can also be something that you do with friends. And when you do, maybe swap papers and provide feedback or ask for feedback back, it's really important that you make distinguishes in terms of what you want to make sure that your paper has and what they should have in their paper, right? So it's important to highlight specific things that we want to look for here, right? You may want to do it in a couple passes. Generally, when I'm doing edits, I will do one read to make sure that all of my transitions make sense, that all the ideas are organized well. And then I'll do a read to make sure that the grammar is okay, right? That I've used the right words, that I've got a nice variety of sentence structures, because sentence variety makes it interesting to the reader. You know, if we continued doing this is Spot, see Spot run, Spot likes the ball, like that would get kind of boring pretty quick, right? And we want to make sure that our readers stay engaged so they can hear all of the great thoughts that you have, right? We want to make sure that you're not losing your reader, and having sentence variety can help with that. Okay, so it certainly goes without saying, but sometimes eliciting feedback can be stressful, right? So when you give feedback, it's important to be kind about it. But it's also important that when you're getting feedback from people, you're asking for feedback from people that you trust, right? You want to make sure that it's from people who aren't just going to say, hey, this is something you messed up and need to fix, right? Like, hey, this is bad. Hey, this transition is awful. You want to make sure that you're touching base with folks who can give you stuff more constructive than that. Hey, this feedback, I mean, this transition isn't as strong as it could be because ... and like give you a reason why that transition isn't strong. Okay, and then do the same thing with anyone that you give feedback to. Make sure that you're providing specifics about how it's kind of missing the mark and what they could do in order to make it better. I do want to indicate that that's not necessarily a green light to say, hey, you should word it exactly this way that I think it should be worded. No, we still want to make sure that it is their voice that they're communicating. Okay. So here is an example of providing feedback that is constructive and isn't just a litany, like an itemized list of everything that that student could have done better, right? So I love this part about focusing on a high order skill and a low order skill. So a high order skill would be supporting evidence. Like you make a couple of great points, but then you just kind of leave those points there. You don't say anything to support them. If you support those points with evidence, that idea is going to be much stronger, right? So that's a higher order skill in a way that you could provide that feedback. And then a lower order skill would be maybe focusing on some grammar, like, hey, you have an excess of commas here. Maybe brush up on some comma rules and take out any unnecessary commas. Or, hey, you tend to use a lot of run-on sentences. Let's see if we can figure out a way to break up some of these sentences so those thoughts aren't as long for your reader to absorb. Okay, awesome. So now, here we are. So writing, just like any discipline, is something that only gets better with practice. Okay, I think sometimes folks are just like, oh, I need to do the assignment for school and then I'm done and I don't have to worry about it anymore. But writing is just like any sport, any performance art, any of it, right? There is so much practice that has to go into it. And so often students only write when an assignment is due. And the analogy that I use with my students, depending on what their interests are, is could you imagine if the only time you played basketball was when you stepped on the court for a game? Or for anyone who's in music, right? The only time that you played your instrument was when you went on stage for a concert, and that was it. How do you think that basketball game's gonna go? How do you think that band concert's gonna go? Probably not the greatest. And writing is the same way. So one might think though, but writing is like this big kind of amorphous thing. How do you practice it, right? I'm so glad you asked. It doesn't come natural to many. And the first thing that we want to do is something that is very, very, very intrinsic to Applerouth's why, is to focus on a growth mindset. Okay, so a growth mindset indicates that we all have the ability to learn more. We all have the capacity to improve more. The opposite of a growth mindset is a fixed mindset. Okay, and oftentimes when I'm in the beginning of a relationship with my students, they come in with a lot of fixed mindsets. I'm just not a good writer, or math just isn't my thing. I'm not a math person. I hear that one a lot. I heard that one today even, right? So a fixed mindset is a negative self-belief that says this is just a part of who I am and it is unchangeable. There's nothing that can be done about it. And fixed mindset can actually have a pretty negative effect on your psyche, frankly. And we'll get into that here, right? So, and when I mean that it affects your psyche, I mean like literally what is happening in your brain. So we talk about this in Applerouth's Guide to Success, Academic Success. It's the resource that we use with our students who are just looking to do like general study skills improvement. But the research indicates that if you have a fixed mindset, it reinforces that negative self-belief, but it also literally blocks learning paths in your brain. Like it discourages neurons from forming the paths that are necessary to learn whatever skill it is that you're learning. Like literally a fixed mindset affects your brain. Like it's wild. A growth mindset promotes curiosity, which is one of the things that is just crucial to creating someone who's excited about learning or opening the door to learning something new. It literally activates those neuron paths and gets those neurons firing in new ways. So a growth mindset indicates or asks, what can I learn from this experience? It didn't go as smoothly as I thought it would, but what can I take from this? What lessons can I learn here? So it reinforces that positive self-belief that I am capable of doing this. I just need to learn a few more things. And studies indicate that students who have a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset are less likely to repeat whatever mistakes they had made. Students who have fixed mindsets are generally going to keep making the same mistake over and over and over again because they've believed that negative self-talk that says they aren't capable of doing any better than that. Okay, so first things first, in order to practice writing, we have to believe that we can improve. We have to adopt a growth mindset. Okay, so once we have decided to adopt a growth mindset, and I'm not going to say that it's like easy, right? Like flipping a switch. Oftentimes folks have to combat whatever negative things they've been telling themselves for years, right? So when I say make a commitment to having a growth mindset, I mean making a commitment to try it, right? Making a commitment to at least trying bringing in those kinds of thoughts when we do these exercises. Okay. So then another way to but anywho, so that's step one. But then when we get to the actual writing itself, there are some other like really specific things that we can do to grow, and that is read, write, and of course revise again. So this comes back to what we were talking about earlier when I was talking about our athletes and our performers, right? If the only time that you played basketball is when you got on the court, probably wouldn't go so well. We got to practice. I know when I was in high school and college, I was a musician. I played clarinet, woo, band geeks. And one thing that my lesson instructor had me do as homework was she would have me listen to professional clarinetists. She would send me home with a CD and say, hey, I want you to listen to these tracks and come back with some notes, especially if it was a professional who had played a piece that I'd been working on for a while, right? Listening to how they did certain passages kind of opened my eyes to how I could do different things better. Not like them, just better. It's the same way with reading. With writing, one of the best ways that we can grow as writers is read good writing, right? So if you are writing fantasy and you want to write a fantasy novel as an adult, like read good fantasy novels. Like see what those themes are that come up. If you want to be an investigative journalist, read good investigative journalism. Like it indicates to you what the things that they are doing that makes them successful. So you can see what habits that they do that you can adopt. So when you read, there are some questions you want to keep in mind, right? We don't want to just read for the sake of reading. See if you can answer all of these questions, right? Obviously, you're not going to get a chance to sit down with the author and ask them themselves, but if you can answer all the questions here based off of what they wrote, that tells you that what they wrote was good, that they communicated their idea clearly enough for you to pick it up. That also means, like, if it's clear to you that they're doing things that you should incorporate into your own writing as well. So that's certainly something that we want to keep in mind. Okay, so then now we get to it. The way that you get better at writing is by writing. And it's really kind of a discipline. There are lots of ways that you can grow as a writer. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of different exercises that I've found helpful, that I know my colleague Matt, who led a similar webinar earlier this month, has found helpful. And some of them are just like tried and true. So I definitely want to make sure that you all have access to these. So the first exercise is morning pages. This is an exercise that a different grad school professor had me do when I was in grad school, and we had to turn in our morning pages journals every week for a grade. So essentially what morning pages is you, first thing you do in the morning for 10 to 15 minutes is you just write. And the point of this is just keep that pencil moving. You're not to stop moving that pencil for the duration of the exercise, no matter what is on your mind. And for me, especially as I was getting started with that, it was challenging, right? Because sometimes first thing in the morning, there's not a whole lot to say. There would be days where for like 3 or 4 sentences in a row, I would just write, I need my coffee, I need my coffee, I need my coffee. But the goal is just to keep it moving, right? And then eventually you work through kind of that block. So you probably won't use a lot of that information. It's kind of just to like clear the slate for the day. It's like if athletes do some warm-ups in the morning before doing conditioning later in the afternoon. Or I know a lot of professional musicians will get up in the morning and they'll do some long tones or some scales before going to a big rehearsal later that day. Right. So it's just to kind of like get things warmed up, get the juices flowing. And if doing that for 10 to 15 minutes every single morning sounds really overwhelming right now, start 2 days a week. Do it on Mondays and Thursdays. Keep your weekends off, right? And then as that feels more comfortable, add a third day in and a fourth day. I think you'll find that if you commit to doing that practice, it'll allow you to get to stuff that you actually want to write later in the day much more quickly, because you've kind of cleared out your head from extra fluff. Okay. So another fun exercise is to throw back to Twitter. So I know the throwback part of that might seem a little odd, but I think for most of the high school students, middle school, elementary, throwback, Twitter certainly feels like a throwback. This was actually an assignment that I had in grad school from a different grad school professor, where he wanted us to write chapter summaries. But a big part of that class was teaching us how to communicate complex ideas in concise ways. So literally, he only gave us 180 characters in order to communicate one chapter summary. But the hallmark of a good author is being able to communicate complex ideas in a concise way. So I would recommend doing this with your summer reading. So I know that everybody has books they have to read for summer assignments. Do a tweet as a chapter summary. And if you can catch all of the main themes of that chapter in 180 characters, that means that like you're really honing that communication tool of yours. So it sounds a little silly, but if you can master that, that's going to allow you to communicate your ideas much more clearly. Okay. Some other things for our more creative folks is treating things as a creative prompt, right? So taking a look at images, you know, like if you're on Snapchat, Instagram, or wherever, there's always images on your timeline, right? So write a story based on it. So in this case, you know, you might want to ask yourself a question like, who are you in this story? Are you a kid? Why are all the other kids staring at you? Did you just tell a joke that they didn't think was funny? Or are you a dog? Or did you just turn into a dog? And a couple of the kids seemed kind of surprised, except for the one in the yellow and white striped shirt, right? There are lots of ways that you can go with this. Just looking at an image and asking yourself a question on that image, and then write a story, see where it takes you. Okay. For those of you who feel like a little bit less like the short story thing isn't your jam, then you could try something like this, something a little bit more memoir style. What is an experience that you've had that you would like to do again? Who's a famous person from history that you would like to meet? And on the market, there are so many resources that are full of prompts like this. You can probably Google some actually. I know when I was in high school, my creative writing teacher had a book that was actually the shape of a cube. It was called The Writer's Block. Haha, it looked like a block. And every page was just full of questions like this, just one-off questions like this. And every now and then he'd have us do a writing warm-up where he'd grab his little writer's block, flip to a random page, and we'd write on it for 15 minutes. Another fun resource I got, I think I got this at Target. There are plenty of journals where they give you kind of like the theme of a story and several things that you have to include and write a story based off that. So like this one, I just flipped to a random one. The villain is really the hero. The story must include witchcraft, recommend sand dollar, fisticuff, paprika, gibberish, nightlight, and an eyeball, right? So there are lots of fantastic resources out there that are just about like getting that pen moving. Okay. So if we're looking at more of the argumentative or persuasive arguments and you want to work on that, you can look at just any kind of statement and ask yourself, do you agree or disagree with it and why? So we've got a couple of prompts up here. You know, there is a little note there at the bottom. If you are an elementary school, middle school student, this is a great place to start in terms of articulating your own opinions, right? Agree, disagree is a fantastic place to start. For my older high school students, particularly my juniors and seniors, particularly if you're doing AP exams or doing dual enrollment in college, we want to try and move a little bit beyond that binary, right? Because nuance and context are important, right? Because nuance lets us know that everything's not just yes, no, hot, cold, left, right, whatever. There are lots of shades of gray in between all of those things. So you may be asking, what does it look like to write an argumentative essay based on one of these prompts with nuance? So glad you asked. So we took the example, all good things come to those who wait. My response to that, and this is, you know, a little bit more cut and dry than I would put in an essay, but there's only so much room on the PowerPoint slide. My argument would be that context matters. For example, in baking, it is good to wait. You want to wait until the cake is finished in order to enjoy it, or else you can make yourself and your guests very sick. It would also waste all of the time that you had spent before putting the cake in the oven, that you had spent prepping the ingredients and all of that good stuff. So in that case, yes, it is good to wait and good things come from that. During a race though, I need to go when the ref says go, or sometimes going back to basketball. If there's an open shot, I need to take that shot because that opportunity might not come again, right? So to the phrase, all good things come to those who wait, a little bit of nuance there. Depends on the context. So that's an example of how you might respond to a persuasive prompt, a little bit of nuance. It's also worth noting that this isn't wishy-washy, right? Because I think that that's something that some students are afraid of when they get into something like this. Because they're like, well, I don't want to come across like I haven't made up my mind. And it's like, okay, yes, we understand that. But wishy-washiness would be like, yes, all good things come to those who wait. I had a friend who waited on something and things turned out really terrible for them, but it's still true that all good things come to those who wait. That's wishy-washy thinking. So when it comes to a more nuanced response like this, it's about having a clear argument to focus and really providing examples that highlight that argument you're making. Awesome. So another fantastic writing exercise is to explain how to do something. This is something that I've done with elementary school kids. And then we do an exercise where they read me their instructions and I follow them annoyingly literally. And then they see very quickly where they have left out steps. So this is a really fun one to do with elementary school students, but for our older students, it's also a really fantastic exercise in highlighting how observant you are. This is fantastic if you are hoping to do a lot of analytical writing, and for my creative writers there who want to communicate stories. Right? If you're trying to describe the setting, like you're setting the scene and you're trying to describe like if something's happening in the woods and someone's behind a rock and all this kind of stuff, you have to make it super clear what that setting looks like because your audience doesn't know. They're not in your head. So exercises like this can really help you see how much attention to detail you're giving. I included the example of the hand washing here because pre-COVID, I don't think any of us realized there were that many steps to washing our hands. But somebody had to sit down and figure out if I was to teach someone step by step how to wash their hands, turns out there are a few more steps than we thought. Okay. So even with these works, I would say probably the one exception to this is the morning pages, because that's just about getting the pencil moving. Even with these exercises, it's important to revise, right? To go back and see what we can do to make it more concise, to make sure that the idea we're communicating is clear, because this is the part of the practice, right? Even with practice, we want to get feedback. Even with practice in athletics, right? Your coach gives you feedback about what you can do better, so you can apply that feedback to the real life game. Same with performing arts. You want to listen to the feedback that your instructor is giving you in practice so you can apply it to the recital. Okay, so we definitely want to make sure that you're taking opportunity to get the feedback on your revisions so that you can even make that practice shine a little bit. Okay, awesome. Well, we are approaching the end of our webinar tonight. A couple of things, and then as time allows, we'll have a couple of questions. We are coming out with a brand new writing guide. It's super exciting. The physical copy of the book will be available in September, but we are actually already tutoring this content. So you'll have some of the things we talked about tonight, some other things that were not included tonight, because again, with 1 hour to talk about how to improve as a writer, it's just not a lot of time to get all that in, you know? But there are prompts in here. Kind of like some of the prompts that we talked about tonight. There are other exercises that you can do to improve as a writer. So be on the lookout for that here soon. But I also want to highlight a couple other things that are going on at Applerouth. So we are in the middle of a mental health webinar series. We've got a couple of great ones coming up. So looking at teens and technology, practical tips for parents. We know that with technology these days, you know, there are studies on how it affects folks' mental health. So we'll have a couple experts on to talk about that on August 1st. Teens and their friends, how to build your students' social emotional skills. I would say even after doing, you know, quarantine school for 2 years in some places, everyone's social emotional skills kind of took a hit there because we weren't socializing. So we'll have some experts on the panel to talk about how to help your students dig back into that. And we're also going to be looking at anxiety, which I think as pressure on students is continuing to mount in terms of their performance, the anxiety is mounting as well. So practical tips for parents and how they can help support their students there. We'll also be doing writing workshops. So we'll be using some of that curriculum that we just talked about with that book when it's here in September. And you can get connected with a program advisor to learn more about that. And then last but certainly not least, we also have some events coming up for our SAT ACT folks. So the last weekend in July is National Practice Test Weekend, where you can test drive the SAT or the ACT and figure out maybe which test might make sense for you to focus on. And enrollment for that starts on July 19th. So definitely be on the lookout for that in your inbox. We have online options all over the country, and then we've got some in-person options in Atlanta, the Washington, D.C. metro area, and Seattle. All right, fantastic. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left for questions, and I think I saw some pinging in the chat here. All right, fantastic. Yes, you all will receive a copy of the slides. And yes, the webinars are for everybody. Fantastic. Well, I will give us just a couple of moments if anybody has a question relevant to the content tonight. All right, fantastic. So we've got a couple of questions here. So how can we help seniors who are not great at this? Good question. I think honestly, a great place to start is just to get them writing. If they feel like they're not great at this, right? We've got that whole fixed mindset thing. They may not feel comfortable going out on an edge, right? They may not feel comfortable going out on that ledge and trying. So creating a safe opportunity for them to try some of these exercises, I think would be a good place to start. And maybe asking them some questions about like, you know, this seems a little bit maybe intimidating for you. Why do you think that is? So I think that that would be a great place to start, and then providing them with some of these activities and letting them feel it out, see which one feels comfortable for them. Okay, awesome. And then will these sessions be recorded? Will there be access to them? I believe it's for everyone who has registered, and I'll let my colleague who's in the chat answer that. And then how should I track my writing progress? That's a fantastic one, a question. So if you have friends that you get feedback from, or maybe a teacher, or maybe you have a tutor, you know, I would make sure that you're kind of going back to the same people with time spread out, right? So that way, you know, they can see an early sample of your writing, and then they can see how you grow from that early sample. If you keep going to different people all of the time, they're not going to know where you started, and therefore they're not going to see how much you've grown. Okay, so when you get feedback, I'd recommend going to the same folks, unless you find out those folks aren't giving you good feedback. Then it might be appropriate to ask someone else. Awesome. And then last question for this evening, how long does it take to develop writing skills? That is a fantastic question. You're probably not going to like my answer to that. That is a lifelong skill. So I've been working at Applerouth for about 9 years now and helping students build their writing skills. I do a lot of writing myself outside of Applerouth, and I'm still growing as a writer. I am still doing all of these things, eliciting feedback from folks who I know are also good writers, and taking their feedback seriously. I'm doing these exercises. So it's a lifelong skill. But I would say, in terms of if you're looking to see improvement in school, I would say maybe a couple of months of dedicated focus working on this, and you'll see some improvement. Will it be a huge improvement? I think that's kind of up to what kind of feedback you are willing to accept and incorporate into your writing, and how many of these practices that you're willing to try. But in terms of just generally, it's a lifelong thing. All right, fantastic. Well, you all have been wonderful this evening. I hope you have a fantastic evening. Be on the lookout for this recording in your inbox. And if you have any questions from tonight, you can definitely reach out to our main line and connect with any of our program advisors. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a fantastic evening.